Hello once again. I have got something really special to show in today's video. Allow me to open it up here. This is a Bradford brand record changer made in 1964. This was given to me as a Christmas gift by Bridget and her parents. This came out of Bridget's parents' basement. Basically, as the story was told to me, they discovered this thing in the basement. I don't know if they even knew it existed there. And it was all covered in sawdust and decades of grime. And Bridget and her parents spent a considerable amount of effort cleaning it up into a semi-presentable state. And then they gave it to me for Christmas. This thing, as I received it, was barely functional, but it was in great need of mechanical and electronic restoration. And I am proud to say that over the last couple of weeks, I have successfully fully restored this thing mechanically and electronically. This thing is still in need of a lot of cosmetic restoration, but functionally, it is 100% now. This thing works perfectly, and it sounds beautiful. And I am just so pleased with this thing, and I just really love it. This was just a fantastic Christmas present, and a really fun restoration job. And I really love using this thing now that it's fully functional. So let's take a look at what we've got here physically. It is a fairly large suitcase style portable turntable. It's got these speakers. These are probably 4-inch speakers. I don't know how powerful of a speakers they are. I would say they're probably 2 or 3 watts each. The amplifier is probably at most 1 watt per channel. But it's certainly loud enough. This thing gets loud if you want it to, and it sounds really good. These are really nice, big speakers. Definitely worlds above what you would get on a modern suitcase-style turntable, like a Crosley or Victrola, one of those. This is a record changer, which means you can stack multiple records on it, usually up to 10 or so. And it will drop the records one by one, play them one at a time. Once all the records in the stack have been played, you turn the entire stack around, put it back down, and then it plays the B-sides of all the discs. Something that was really nice and was greatly helpful for me in mechanically restoring this thing is this is a standardized record changer mechanism that was used by tons of manufacturers. This mechanism was manufactured by a company called The Voice of Music. And The Voice of Music was one of the largest providers of turntable mechanisms for cheap, low-end manufacturers of turntables from the 50s through to the 70s. This was the BSR before BSR. YouTubers like V Westlife have detailed the BSR record changers of the 70s and 80s that were used in many different brands of cheap record changers of their time. And this mechanism, made by The Voice of Music, was what came before the BSRs. And what's really awesome is that although The Voice of Music doesn't exist anymore, there is a website run by Voice of Music enthusiasts that gives you not only all the information you would ever need to restore one of these Voice of Music record changers, but they sell parts for them. If you need a turntable platter or a knob or any mechanical or electrical part for one of these Voice of Music record changer mechanisms, you can get them from that website fairly affordably too, and that I think is just really excellent. Luckily, I didn't need any mechanical parts to fix this thing, and that's really awesome. So yeah, standard record changer mechanism made by The Voice of Music, and it's really nice to have one of these, and it certainly made it nicer to restore with the wealth of information online. These are pretty well-loved mechanisms. They were cheap and low-end for their time, like the BSRs that came later. But unlike the BSRs, these were not crappy mechanisms. They were fairly decent. They were as nice as you could hope for a low-end mechanism. And they're aging incredibly well. This one now going on 56 years old. This one is working just fine. All I had to do was clean and oil and grease the heck out of it, and it came right back to life. And something really great, not all voice of music mechanisms had this, but this one does. Something that's really fantastic about this thing. Take a look at this. 78, 45, 33, 16. This is a quad speed mechanism. It supports all 4 vinyl record speeds. 78 for the really early 78 RPM records. And then 16, which some of you might not have ever even heard of, 16 RPM was not used very much, but when it was used for what they called talking books. You know, like books or other word publications that would be transcribed onto a record. You know, sort of like the predecessor to today's audiobook. So you could buy records with, you know, books or magazines or whatever on them, and they would run at 16 RPM to fit more content on them, obviously. And this machine supports 16 RPM. Not a lot of them did. So that's really, really cool and kind of surprising given the caliber of this machine, but it's really nice. Right here is the 45 RPM adapter. So you stick that right there, and you can stick your 45 on it. It's supposed to be retained by this here, but the little side walls here on both sides that sort of would have come around to actually keep the adapter in place, they have long broken off, so it just kind of lays there now. Power cord comes out right here. It's got a little notch here to put it in. It's a plastic power cord, which is kind of unique for how old this thing is, but you can see it's definitely an old-fashioned cord when you look at it. At least I assume it's plastic. It feels like plastic, unless it's really hard rubber, but it's not cracked or anything, so I wouldn't think so. Speakers have cloth grills on them, really, really nice. And the reason they have these big holes on them is because you can see these are the wires for each speaker, and they go down inside the nether regions there. But you can actually detach these speakers, and the wires pull out quite a ways so that you can actually detach the speakers and set them, you know, farther away from the unit to get better stereo separation or whatever. If you had this more as a permanent installation rather than a portable unit, you can set your speakers up and do that. Bradford was the brand name used for electronics of the chain of department stores W.T. Grant, which operated from the early 1900s up until the mid-1970s. W.T. Grant competed with the likes of Kmart and Woolworths, and Bradford was their house brand of electric and electronic devices, manufactured by other companies, obviously. This is a solid-state device. The amplifier in this thing is all transistorized, and of course, it is stereo capable. There's your amplifier controls. You get separate volume controls for your left and right channels, and you get a combined, what we'd now call a tone control. Turn it this way, more bass. Turn it this way, more treble. I just leave it in the middle. Sounds just fine. This must have been owned by a university student, perhaps? Phi Sigma Pi. So there's a lot more cosmetic restoration to be done. The black trim here is falling off. This covering right here is falling off. I'll have to see if maybe wood glue or even just Gorilla Glue can fix that back up. These metal clasps are a bit corroded. I should be able to clean those up, no problem, with some Brasso. But all things considered, this thing is worlds better than what it was when I received it. So let's talk about what it was like when I received it. When I received this thing, unfortunately, and I only say unfortunately just because, you know, you could kill something this old by doing it. But when Bridget and her parents dug this thing out of the basement, they went right ahead and plugged it in to see if it worked. Bad idea. That's fixing to blow some transistors, or if this had tubes, you could be fixing to blow some tubes like that. If there were any paper capacitors in this, which there wasn't, that would have been a bad idea. There's just things you can go wrong when you take something this old and then just apply, after decades of sitting, apply 120 to it without putting it through a dim bulb tester or a variac. But they didn't know that. I don't blame them. But that's what they did. They just went right ahead and plugged this thing in and turned it on. And the platter did spin, although not very well. And there was also quite a loud humming coming from the speakers, obviously bad capacitors. And that's how I got this thing. So the first thing I did was I removed the platter. This thing has a really nice, fairly heavy metal platter with a rubber slip mat glued on top. I had to re-glue the slip mat. So to pick up the platter, you basically just grasp it with both hands, lift it up, work it around the little end part of the stock here, and platter comes off. Again, very heavy, very nice, feeling metal, and that's good that it's like this, because that helps, you know, regulate the speed, keep a constant speed, keep wow and flutter to a minimum. So very nice part, and a lot different from the BSR turntable mechanisms that became the standard after this. And after taking the platter off, I discovered a couple of things that I found very interesting. I was not expecting them. First of all, this thing uses not a DC motor, it actually uses a shaded pole AC motor to drive the turntable. And that's actually really nice, because shaded pole motors, like any AC induction motor, they run at a constant speed. Depending on the design of the motor, at 60 hertz, it could run at 1800 RPM for a 4-pole motor, or 3600 RPM for a 2-pole motor. But they run at a constant speed, as long as there's not too much of a load on them stalling them out. So that's really nice. And then the second thing I found that surprised me was this uses not a belt to connect the motor to the platter, but an idler. This is a rubber idler that sits up against the motor, and you can see if I change the speed, it changes what part of the motor spindle the idler sits up against. So the motor spindle has 4 steps on it, one for each of the 4 speeds. And there's 78 RPM. And that changes the speed. So when the unit is turned on, the idler here is mechanically pushed against the motor. And then over here, the idler spins up against the inner rim of the platter. So the idler runs against the inside of the rim of the platter, and that's what turns the platter. Very interesting system. Not too uncommon either. Many other turntable mechanisms used this system. So when I took the platter off for the first time, I found a couple of things. First of all, the motor was partially frozen. It was not spinning very well at all. The idler was also not spinning very well. Also, the idler was filthy. The surface of the idler that rests up against the motor and the platter, it was very dirty. And I was a bit worried at first. When I first got this thing and I realized it had an idler, I'm like, oh crap, I'm going to have to replace that idler, and I'm never going to find a replacement for it. Well, first of all, not only can you buy replacement idlers from that website I talked about, which is awesome, but second of all, this idler's totally fine. 56 years old, and this rubber part is still perfectly fine, which surprises me to no end. It's obviously not as in as good shape as it used to be, but it's still perfectly pliable. And luckily this thing was stored not turned on, so there's not a big divot in the idler. If you leave these things turned on, let me cut power to it here so I can turn it on. When you turn it on and the idler presses up against the motor spindle. You leave it like that for years and it's going to create a dimple in the idler there. Not good. Luckily this one was turned off. But yeah, I cleaned the surface of the idler with isopropyl alcohol and it came out just fine. I had to get access to the underside of this mechanism here, which involved removing 4 screws. And this entire thing lifts up, and then you have access to the underside of the mechanism. And using this really cool Spout oil bottle, let's see if I can get it all the way out here. Bridget's dad gave this to me for Christmas. It's a bottle of oil with a super long spout on it. And this is sold by a distribution company in Maine called the Maintenance Connection. It says, highest quality multi-use turbine oil. And Bridget's dad uses these at work. So he snagged one and gave it to me for Christmas, which I think it's really cool. As you can see, I've been using this just because the spout makes it so convenient. But I didn't even have to take the shaded pole motor apart. I just took that oil, I soaked the front bearing with oil, and then I soaked the rear bearing as best as I could. And that's all I needed. It spins really good now. So I've got the thing apart here and found a date code on the motor, October 27th, 1964. And something really interesting I found was that somebody's been in here before. Inside the cabinet was this box for presumably the stylus that's on it. So that's really hilarious. Just a box for a stylus inside this cabinet. I also took the idler off. There's a little C-clip there that you remove, and then the idler pulls off. I oiled the shaft that the idler spins about and put it back on, and now the idler spins just fine. And then, of course, the platter has bearings in it too. I cleaned those as best I could and dripped some oil in there. And I put some lithium grease on this shaft. And after that work, to the motor, the idler, and the platter, that's all this thing needed. And it was spinning pretty much almost perfect. This thing runs about 2 to 4% slow, depending on the speed. When you first run this thing, after sitting without running for a day or so, it's noticeably slow. You can really hear it when you play music. But after it runs for a few minutes, it speeds up. And then it gets to close enough that you can't really detect it. I've got perfect pitch, unfortunately, so I can detect it, but most people won't. But for example, at 33 RPM, this thing spins, once it's all warmed up, it spins at like 32.5 RPM. So it's a bit slow, but it's definitely listenable. And perhaps as I run this thing more and more, it will get closer and closer to the correct speed. Other than that, I cleaned up the rest of the mechanics on the underbelly of the mechanism as best as I could. The changer mechanism was working kind of erratically just because old grease had turned hard and things just weren't moving as well as they should, and some things weren't working right. So I cleaned up the rest of the mechanism, greased and oiled everything I could, and now the changer mechanism is working about as well as you could hope. There's only one thing that the changer mechanism does that I'm not sure if it's supposed to or not, but when you have the retaining arm out of the way here, which is what you would do if you were just putting on a single record to play, I would assume that when it gets to the end of the record and it returns the tone arm, that it would turn off the system. When you are using the changer mechanism, and it gets to the last record, and it knows when it's at the last record because the arm falls all the way down. When the tone arm returns, it'll automatically turn the power switch off. You can actually see it turn the switch. I would assume that when the changer's not being used, that when it gets to the end of the disc and returns the tone arm, that it should turn it off so you can pick up the disc and flip it around. But it doesn't. You hear it clunk like it does, but the power switch doesn't move. So there might be an issue with this mechanism where it won't turn itself off when you're in, non-changing mode. Or maybe that's actually the way it's supposed to work. Either way, it's not an issue to me. It's super easy just to turn the knob off yourself. So, might be a small issue there, but it's nothing I actually care about. You might have been able to tell by now that the mechanism is mounted on springs. See that? Which is nice because if you're playing a record and something jostles the machine, it helps absorb the impact a little bit. It actually works fairly well. It provides some pretty nice dampening. So that was pretty much the extent of the mechanical restoration. As for the electronic restoration, and I point the camera over here because the amplifier circuit is actually a box right under here. The 3 potentiometers here are actually soldered to the amplifier box, and these potentiometers that actually screw in here into the board here. So these knobs are what actually mount the amplifier. So like I said, loud buzzing, obviously bad capacitors. So having this thing apart, I was able to use pliers to unscrew these hex washer things. And after I got the 3 of those unscrewed, the amplifier circuit became free, and while I wasn't too worried about getting it restored, because it's all transistorized, I would have my work cut out for me if this thing used a tube amplifier. I did have a bit of a challenge because this is the first piece of equipment I've ever worked on that used point-to-point circuitry. When you look at the amplifier, there's no circuit board, there's no PCB. Everything is soldered to each other and just suspended in mid-air. It looks like a rat's nest of components. There are these little racks, sort of like primitive proto boards with tabs sticking out of them that you can solder things to. But for the most part, everything is just, suspended in mid-air, and it's kind of scary. Another thing that was scary is I didn't want to damage anything, namely those very old transistors. Early transistors were very, very delicate. Even physically, they were really delicate. You could tell just by looking at them. They have these long, really thin legs. And I definitely had to be careful when I was waving a soldering iron around and unsoldering stuff. So this thing has 6 electrolytic capacitors in it. And it had a few ceramic capacitors in it too. I wasn't worried about them. But 6 electrolytic capacitors, 2 of them were of the normal type, but the other 4 were actually built into this big metal can, which was, up until the 70s or so, how a lot of stuff did, usually filter caps. If you needed a bunch of big, high-value, high-voltage capacitors, you'd have like 3 or 4 capacitors built into this big metal can that looked like one giant capacitor, but it would have like 4 or 5 leads coming out of it. So luckily, these big can-type capacitors, they're called, they actually say on them what color wire corresponds to what capacitance. So in the one I had to deal with here, like it had a black wire that was ground, but then it had like a red wire for like 100 microfarad at 75 volts. It actually had 2 of those, and then the other 2 parts of it were each 50 microfarad at 75 volts. I was originally just going to remove the can, but in the end, because, this can is made of thick metal and it was soldered directly to the metal chassis of the amplifier, my crappy little soldering iron actually couldn't heat up the solder to remove it. The metal was just taking away the heat too quickly, and my soldering iron just doesn't have enough power to melt it. So what I did was I actually kept the metal can there, and I just cut the wires, and I used the wires to solder in the new capacitors, and that's what worked. And I just bought all the new capacitors on DigiKey, 6 of them. I just bought the cheapest ones of the right values that I could find, and they did the job. So now when you turn this thing on, no more buzzing. You do get a bit of hissing. You might hear some hissing coming out of the speakers, but that was there before I replaced the electrolytics, so I'm not worried about it. I would assume that that's the way this thing was out of the factory. It could be, perhaps it has, maybe the ceramic capacitors are going bad. Maybe if I replace the ceramic capacitors, it would fix that hissing. But I'm willing to hedge my bets on assuming that it's just the way this thing was when it was new. I'm not worried about it anyway. It certainly doesn't detract from the sonic quality of this thing. It's pretty quiet. So yeah, 6 capacitors replaced. I held my breath. I first plugged this thing in on a dim bulb circuit to make sure I didn't do anything catastrophically wrong. And everything tested fine. And that was it. So now this thing was electronically restored. Well, almost. The 3 potentiometers here were all super dirty. You would turn it and it would just crackle really loudly. So while I was inside the amplifier circuit, I sprayed the heck out of the potentiometers with contact cleaner, and that fixed that. There's still a little bit of crackliness, but for being 56 years old, I'm certainly not going to worry about it. It's worlds better than it was before. Probably after 56 years, even the resistors have gone out of spec. But I'm not going to worry about those. Maybe someday, years down the road, I'll do a more complete electronic overhaul of this thing. But for now, this thing sounds great. I'm not going to worry about stuff like resistors and stuff like that. Getting the electrolytics changed was the most important part. Oh, speaking of the electrolytics again, I mentioned how 2 of the electrolytic capacitors were 50 microfarad. You can't get 50 microfarad capacitors now. They're not a thing anymore. Or you still can, but they're insanely expensive just because it's not a standard value. So I replaced those 2 capacitors with 47 microfarad capacitors. 47 is a standard value for capacitors, and obviously those work just fine. The capacitors of 56 years ago would have had such wide tolerances that 47 microfarad is probably still within the tolerance of the original capacitors. So replacing a 50 with a 47, especially on something like this, it's definitely not going to have any issue. Some electronics restoration purists may scold me for replacing the big metal can capacitor with 4 modern capacitors rather than trying to reform the metal can capacitor, which is something that can be done in some cases if you just hook it up to a dim bulb circuit and just run it on power for a long time, usually after a few hours or days or something. The capacitors will reform and it'll perform within its original specification again. Yeah, I don't operate that way. When it comes to restoring something like this, my goal is to just make it functional, and I'm more comfortable just putting new capacitors in than trying to restore old capacitors, which may just fail again in the future, or they'll never perform quite as well as new capacitors will. Or I may just waste my time and the capacitor won't reform at all. All I can say is I ran this thing for a couple of hours on the original capacitors, and the humming in the speakers never reduced at all. So I think I did the right thing anyway. But yeah, when it comes to something like this, and it's just electronic components, it's not like I'm putting a new mechanism in and making the thing not original anymore. It's just capacitors. So I just put new ones in and call it a day. Does the job. Oh, something really interesting I just thought of now. The shaded pole motor in this thing is not just a shaded pole motor. It was a purpose-built motor for this particular machine because it's not just a motor, it's a transformer. the coil that generates the electromagnetic field for the motor, in a normal shaded pole motor, you just have this one coil. It connects to power, and then you've got your motor. But in this case, the coil in this motor actually has two sets of windings. It has one set that drives the motor itself, but then it has a second set that uses the electromagnetic field generated by the first set of windings to create a transformer. The second set of windings has less windings, so it outputs a lower voltage. So the motor actually has 4 wires coming out of it, 2 of which are a transformer secondary, which is used to power the amplifier. The power capacitors in the amplifier are rated for 75 volts originally. So this must output, at most 75 volts, maybe 50, maybe a lot less than that, I don't know. But I found that very funny to use the motor as a transformer. Just stick another winding onto it and Bob's your uncle. I thought that was really funny. So I'll show you how you remove the speakers here, but this is totally a two-handed job. You've got this metal clasp up here. Undo that. And remove the rightward speaker first. You sort of have to pull on it. And then the speaker comes out. And then the other speaker here, what you do is you actually disconnect the chain here. So I gotta set my camera down again. But just unhook the chain and then take it out like that. And there. You've detached your speakers. So like I said, if you had this in a more permanent installation, you might want to separate your speakers, give some better stereo separation. Otherwise, if you just want to operate it as a portable unit like I'm going to do here, you can just keep them hooked up. The chain keeps the speakers from falling too far backwards and possibly damaging the hinges or the case. And yeah, that metal clasp under here keeps the two speakers hooked up together when they're mounted to the case, so that the right-hand speaker also doesn't fall backwards. And yeah, that's how you do it. Putting the speaker back on, you just gotta line up with the hinge there. And yeah, slid on pretty easily that time. I've never actually greased these components, so the speakers would probably go on a lot easier if I did that. But that's how you do it. So the last item I needed to work on for this thing to make it fully functional was obviously the cartridge and stylus. Obviously, when you get something like this, you should replace the stylus because you have no idea about the history of the original stylus. For this particular thing though, in this case, I had to replace the entire phono cartridge. The original cartridge was blown. It had no right channel audio. It had left channel audio, but no right channel audio. And I knew it wasn't a fault of the amplifier because when I stuck my finger and touched the contacts, I did get buzzing out of the right speaker. So I knew the amplifier was fine, but the cartridge was not outputting any right channel audio. It was blown, and that happens with older cartridges because the rubber components inside the cartridge can go bad, and then the stylus can't modulate the cartridge anymore physically. But also the cartridge element can go bad. For ceramic and magnetic cartridges, that's not very common, but this thing is old enough that the original cartridge was actually what's called a crystal cartridge. Now, crystal cartridges are similar to ceramic cartridges. You've got a piezoelectric element. The movement of the stylus moves the piezoelectric element, which generates an electric current, which gets fed into the amplifier. So this thing actually had a crystal cartridge in it. Now you can replace a crystal cartridge with a ceramic cartridge, no problem, but the issue with a lot of turntables with crystal cartridges, including this one, is that it was a high output cartridge. The original cartridge, crystal cartridge in this thing, which was a Varco brand cartridge, It was specified to have an output of 1 volt. That's really high. Modern ceramic cartridges are usually in the realm of 1/4 of a volt to half a volt, but this thing, the original cartridge, output 1 volt, and that's an issue because if I put just any old low output ceramic cartridge on this thing, the output might not have been high enough to work well with the amplifier. At best, I'd have to crank the volume up a lot to get adequate volume. But at worst, the equalization would be way off just because the characteristics of the amplifier would make it such that a low input just wouldn't sound very good in the way of equalization. So I had to find a 1 volt, or at least somewhere around there, ceramic cartridge for this thing. Now luckily, there is a cheap and easily available modern ceramic cartridge for this thing that does have that high output, and it's the Fansteel model P228. The Fansteel P228 has a specified output voltage of 0.8 volts, and that's plenty for this thing to work with. This thing is working great with that cartridge, so I'm glad I chose this cartridge. Like I said, this is an easily available cartridge. I'm not sure if they're still made, but they're definitely plentiful and cheap to get. I bought this example for $20, brand new, on eBay, from an eBay seller called Stereo Needles Lady. Some people have mentioned them before. The Voice of Music website that I talked about earlier in the video also sells this cartridge. They sell a ton of cartridges. Because not all Voice of Music turntable mechanisms had this same amplifier. I don't even know if the amplifier in this thing was made by the Voice of Music. They did make some of their own amplifiers, but oftentimes they just made the mechanism and then the amplifier was made by somebody else. So every machine could be different. Had I replaced the amplifier in this thing with a modern one, which is certainly something you can do, then I'd be able to use a modern low output cartridge because the amplifier would be designed to handle that. It's all in what kind of amplifier you have, but in this case I needed a high output 1 volt or thereabouts cartridge, and this 0.8 volt Fansteel P228 works just fine. My example came with the Fansteel DS77 stylus. I forget the rest of the model name, but it includes DS77. It's an odd cartridge. It's an odd stylus. It's a flip-over stylus, you can see. But in this case, both styli are for LPs and 45s. Normally, a flip-over stylus, one will be for LPs and 45s. The other will be for 78s, which require a larger 3mm stylus. But in this case, this has one diamond 0.7mm stylus and then one sapphire 0.7mm stylus. That's really funny. Although I can think of a couple of use cases for that. If you were, by default you'd use the diamond stylus, but if it eventually wore out and you didn't have a replacement stylus on hand, you could switch to the sapphire stylus while you're waiting for a new diamond stylus to come in. Another thing you could do is if you have an old or crappy record, like you just bought at a thrift store or something, and you don't know what the condition of it is, and you don't want to risk hurting your diamond stylus, you can flip it over to the sapphire stylus and just use that as a beater stylus for testing old records. So that's something you can do with this. But yeah, I wasn't sure which type I was getting, but I got the 2 LP styli type with my cartridge. If I want to someday, if I ever get a hold of any 78s, I don't have any at the moment, I can buy a new stylus. I can buy the version that has 1 LP stylus and then 1 78 stylus. That version of the stylus is called the DS73 because it's got a 0.7mm stylus on one end and then a 3mm stylus on the other. So DS73. Mounted in the head shell with no issues. The P228 is designed that the stylus actually clips into a carrier. So you can remove, or rather the cartridge clips into a carrier, and you can actually remove the cartridge and just screw the carrier onto the head shell, which makes it easy to install, and then all you have to do is snap the cartridge onto the carrier. Unfortunately, the carrier of my example, or actually it wasn't the carrier, it was the cartridge itself, one of the clips on the cartridge that attaches it to the carrier broke when I detached the cartridge from the carrier. So I'm gonna have to get a hot glue gun, which I've needed for a long time anyway, and I'll have to just hot glue that part of the cartridge back onto the carrier. So it's just being held on there by friction. It's good enough. It works well enough for now, but yeah, I'll want to fix that before too long. And yeah, other than that, it was a pretty easy installation. I had to readjust the tracking force. Now here's something that, you know, makes these turntables in general probably not desirable at all to anyone that would be considered an audiophile, is that these high output crystal and ceramic cartridges, they require a high tracking force. I weighed this thing when I first got it with the original Varco crystal cartridge, and it was tracking at around 10 grams. And that was par for the course for a lot of the old crystal cartridges. That they needed to track that heavy just because it takes a relatively high amount of force to modulate the crystal element. With this modern ceramic cartridge, 6 to 8 grams is what Fan Steel says this needs to track at. And that's still, you know, that's high by today's standards. Audiophiles will say that it'll absolutely destroy your records. That's not true at all. The original vinyl record specification, I think, specified a maximum of 8 grams of tracking force. And so many of these, you know, so many of these record players for decades used cartridges that had to track at that high of a tracking force. You're not going to destroy your records, especially older records that were made out of denser, higher quality vinyl material. They're not going to be damaged by using them on this. So yeah, Fan Steel P228 needs 6 to 8 grams. You know, that's high. You know, make no mistake about it. I'm not oblivious. That will produce more wear on your records than a lighter tracking cartridge. But at the end of the day, you would have to play your records an obscene number of times before any wear would have to show. Vinyl records are way slower wearing than most people think, as long as you have a fresh stylus and you're not playing your records with a worn-out stylus. I've actually adjusted this thing to track at 5 grams. I find it's working just fine tracking at 5 grams. It's kind of funny. Before I got the new cartridge in the mail, I had adjusted the tone arm with the old cartridge mounted to it to track at 5 grams. And when I got the new cartridge and I put it in and I tested it with a record, it sounded awful. And I was really puzzled as to why. And then I took out my little drug scale here, and I measured the tracking force. It was tracking at 1.8 grams. So yeah, evidently the Fan Steel P228 is a few grams lighter than the original cartridge. It was tracking at 1.8 grams and it sounded horrible. So once I readjusted it to 5 grams, now it's sounding wonderful. The other consideration with these cartridges is because they're high output, they have what's called low compliance. Compliance is how well the stylus can move along, how accurately the stylus can move along the groove of the record to produce an output exactly representing the groove of the record. High output cartridges generally have lower compliance than low output cartridges because the needle is stiffer, the stylus is stiffer, harder to move, because the element, in this case the ceramic element that produces the electric current, it's larger and harder to modulate because it has to produce a higher output. So these higher output cartridges, they have lower compliance, the needle is stiffer, harder to move, and that also increases the wear on the record. But again, in normal use, the wear on a record's not going to be noticeable. You'd have to play your records many, many, many times, like thousands of times on something like this before it would start to wear. So yeah, the audiophiles are going to say that this will destroy your records. I say it's not going to at all. Just make sure your stylus is in good shape. At any rate, it's really great that you can get a modern, affordable cartridge to replace the old high output crystal cartridges on systems like this. So, how about we actually get to demonstrating this thing? So if you want to load this with just a single record, you don't want to bother with the whole changing aspect of it, you can just take your disc and just load it on there. And at this point it'll rest, and if you want to, you could load it up just to use the changing mechanism. But something else you can do is just wiggle the record past the little ridge there that holds it in place, and you can just drop it down yourself. Turn the machine on, pick up your tone arm, and drop it down, just like that. If you want to cancel, you can turn the, even after turning the power knob on, it turns a little bit more to a position called reject. And normally you'd use that to skip a record when you're using the changer and you have a bunch of records loaded up. You can use reject to skip a record, drop the next one, and begin playing that. But when the changer retainer arm is moved out of the way, it changes the reject function, and it'll just take the tone arm back to the home position. Again, I'm not sure if this is actually supposed to turn it off and it's not working properly, or if it's supposed to leave it on like this. I don't know. I now have two LPs loaded on top of each other, and we'll turn it on here and then turn it to reject to begin the first disc. Drops the first disc, puts down the tone arm. And then if I want to go to the next disc, hit reject again. It'll also automatically go through the discs, obviously. Drop the next disc. Same thing, and I'll hit reject again. And because there's no more discs, it'll return to the home position and then actually shut the machine off. So how about 45s? Well, I've got two 45s here. So what we do is, well, first of all, we change the speed to 45. We put down our 45 adapter, like that, and then put down our 45s, move the arm over, like that, then turn it on. Same process. Drops the disc. Now, gotta reject that before YouTube decides I played too much. You may notice that it somehow magically knows that these are 45s, and it doesn't drop the stylus right here, it drops it over here. How it works is there's these two sensors, this little one that pops up right here, and then this little flag right here. And they are used to detect 10-inch and 12-inch discs, respectively. So this can actually detect even the 10-inch records. So if you put a 45 on, when it drops the disc, it doesn't hit any of the flags. So that tells the tone arm to drop it in position for 45. If you put on a 10-inch disc, after the mechanism drops the disc, it'll push this button up. And if there's resistance to the button pushing up, then it knows there's either a 10-inch or 12-inch disc on the platter. If the disc falls past this flag while it's falling, it'll push this flag back and then it'll snap back in place. That tells it it's a 12-inch disc. If this flag isn't touched while the disc drops, but this flag is triggered, then that tells it there's a 10-inch disc. Very nice system. Automatically detect any standard disc size. Very cool. So let's actually get to demonstrating this. Let's actually play a record on it. Now for this video, I have to play something that's not going to be caught by Content ID. However, I will be uploading an unmonetized video after this that'll be a more thorough playback demonstration with some copyrighted music that'll be caught by Content ID. Just because I think this thing deserves to be heard playing more than just music that's so obscure that it isn't picked up by YouTube's Content ID. But for this video, what I'll be playing, I found this really neat 45 at the music store. 45s are 99 cents each, 50 cents if they don't have a sleeve. But I thought this was really cool because the A-side is a piece called The Land of New Brunswick, referencing the province of New Brunswick, where I live. And the B-side is a song called Up in Maine, referencing the state of Maine. I thought this was so cool. I had to tell Bridget as soon as I got home when I found this thing. Super cool. So I'm going to be playing Up in Maine because it's the shorter piece. And it's actually kind of a neat song. It's timed like a bolero, which I think is kind of interesting. Now, of course, this thing doesn't have any direct hookup for audio recording, so what I have is my Olympus LS7 audio recorder mounted on a tripod in the most precarious tripod arrangement you've ever seen. And we're just going to get as good of a audio coupling as we can just right from the speakers. And this is oriented backwards with respect to left and right channels, but I'll flip it around in post. But let's play a 45 here. See how it sounds.
It's the state that sees the first of each new day. There's a feeling of pride, like the swelling of the tide, as I watch the sun rise over Quaddy Bay. Up in Maine, there's a valley where the whispering pine trees grow. Wild and free. When I stop to look around, no matter where I'm bound, up in Maine is where I always want to be. There's a feeling of pride, like the swelling of the tide, as I watch the sun rise over Quaddy Bay. Up in Maine, there's a valley where the whispering pine trees grow, and the river Allagash flows wild and free. When I stop to look around, no matter where I'm bound, up in Maine is where I'll always want to be.
And with that, that is all there is to show of the 1964 Bradford solid-state 4-speed record changer based on a voice of music mechanism. I am just, I'm really in love with this thing, and I am so happy at how well it restored. This thing was sat in a basement for decades, covered in sawdust and all manner of grime, and I wouldn't have blamed this thing for being mechanically completely unrepairable. Just corroded all to hell and just, Lord knows what. And same for the amplifier. I wouldn't have blamed it for being completely dead, blown transistors, whatever, just because of the conditions this was stored in. But not only did it mechanically clean up and work just fine, but electronically, all I had to do was put in new capacitors and clean the potentiometers, and it works just fine. I am so happy with this thing. I think it sounds really, really good. Again, I'm going to be uploading a video after this, showcasing how it sounds, playing more music. And yeah, I just really love this thing. And it's funny because this isn't the only turntable I got for Christmas. Bridget actually bought me, before she and her parents discovered this thing, Bridget had bought me a Audio-Technica AT-LP60X for Christmas. And I've been using that too, and that's a great turntable. That's a great modern turntable based on a magnetic cartridge, and it sounds just awesome. But then I got this thing too, which is awesome. I say as a joke, I have my good turntable, which is the ATLP60X, and then I have my cool turntable, which is this thing. And I love both of them, and they both sound awesome. This thing truly does sound awesome, and it's just so retro cool. Like I said, there's more work to be done. Cosmetically, it has a few issues that have to be fixed up. But functionally, this thing is 100%, and it is just working and sounding beautifully. And I'm really happy that I was able to get it working this well. So there you go. Thank you very much for watching. I do hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.